Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be discussing The Burden of Memory, The Muse of Forgiveness by Wole Soyinka. These are actually two talks that he gave, which were then compiled into this essay form. And they're interlinked essays talking about what happens in a troubled society when a troubled nation seeks reconciliation, is what happened in South Africa at the end of apartheid, and what could happen in Palestine if the Zionist entity is ever defeated. I'm only going to focus on this first essay, The Burden of Memory, in the interest of time, and in referencing this idea that I want to talk about. The Muse of Forgiveness is less about that. And it will make some references to goings on in African politics, particularly in Nigeria, that you may not be familiar with. Don't let that discourage you. The points he's making can easily be considered apart from specific context. So let's get started. So in the acknowledgments, I think just kind of a way for us to get started. The scales of reckoning with mortality are never evenly weighted, alas, and thus it is on the shoulders of the living that the burden of justice must continue to rest. So those who are no longer with us don't have to deal with it in the way that those of us who are still alive and having to deal with the wreckage of what happened have to deal with it. The crimes that the African continent commits against her kind are of a dimension and unfortunately of a nature that appears to constantly provoke memories of the historic wrongs inflicted on that continent by others. There are moments when it almost appears as if there is a diabolical continuity and inevitability to it all, that the conduct of latter-day internal slave runners is merely the stubborn precipitate of a yet unexpiated past. The ancient slave stockades do not seem ever to have vanished. They appear more to have expanded, occupying indiscriminate spaces that often appear contingent with national boundaries. Thus the role of memory, of ancient precedents of current criminality, obviously governs our responses to the immediate and often more savage assaults on our humanity, and to the strategies for remedial action. Faced with such a balancing imposition, the weight of memory against the violations of the present, it is sometimes useful to invoke the voices of the griots, the ancestral shades, and their latter-day interpreters, the poets. Memory obviously rejects amnesia, but it remains amenable to closure that is, apparently, the ultimate goal of social strategies such as truth and reconciliation, and the reparations movement for the enslavement of a continent. It is there that they find common ground, even though the latter does entail, by contrast, a demand for restitution. Both seek the cathartic bliss, the healing that comes with closure. And Soyinka is referring to the crimes on the African continent, and he makes a reference to a medical doctor's contribution in July of 1979. I endorse absolutely the determination of the Armed Revolutionary Council to wash the country clean with the blood of the corrupt. These are murders on the streets, summary executions. I have been telling my friends for some time now that Ghana's only cleansing lotion is the blood of those who so badly let her down through selfishness and corruption. Ghana is so heavily soiled that the blood of 500 can be enough only for the removal of surface dust. To remove the grime and ingrained dirt, the AFRC has to go a great deal further. And this is a doctor endorsing murder as a way of washing clean. So, going back to the idea of truth and reconciliation, Soyinka is asking the difficult question: how can we have truth and reconciliation if we're giving people space and saying we're not going to punish you if you tell us the truth? Will that actually get us the reconciliation that we want? Let us, for a brief moment, superimpose the face of Pol Pot over any one of these public applicants for remission in a parallel process in Cambodia. Is it really given to the human mind to accommodate, much less annul, such a magnitude of man-inflicted anguish? The logic of truth and reconciliation, however, demands that the mind prepare itself for the spectacle of a penitent Pol Pot, freed, morally cleansed, at liberty to go about his business in a humanely restored milieu. This risk-free parade of villains, calmly and occasionally with ill-concealed relish, recounting their roles in kidnappings, tortures, murders, and mutilation, at the end of which absolution is granted, without penalty or forfeit, is either a lesson in human ennoblement or a glorification of impunity. Admittedly, it does constitute at the very least a revelation of the infinite possibilities of human options in the resolution of social crises, and this perhaps must remain our consolation. Even if judgment comes down eventually on the negative import of such a proceeding, there is still an inherent challenge in it that cannot be denied. It is not, after all, an occurrence in a historic vacuum. Within the borders of South Africa's northward neighbor, Malawi, the once president for life, Hastings Banda, did go on trial for his life. He was acquitted, yes, largely on a technicality, but the process of reducing the once all-powerful controller of freedom and restraint, of life and death to an egalitarian uncertainty with his erstwhile victims, is a model of social restitution whose validity cannot be contested. Never was that ubiquitous rubric on West African passenger vehicles, "No condition is permanent," more robustly vindicated. And if you, like me, are affected by just the beauty of Soyinka's prose, you're not alone. He's such a fantastic writer. And there are other models, like Rwanda, in which the international community has again recognized and pursued a role in a process that establishes that there are certain crimes that have ramifications beyond the borders of any nation and constitute crimes against humanity. The problem with the South African choice is therefore its implicit, a priori exclusion of criminality and thus responsibility. Justice assigns responsibility, and few will deny that justice is an essential ingredient of social cohesion. Indeed, I have asserted elsewhere that justice constitutes the first condition of humanity. And even as justice is not served by punishing the accused before the establishment of guilt, neither is it served by discharging the guilty without evidence of mitigation or remorse. We recognize that the application of what in effect is an attribution of mitigation before the proof has, in this case, only one end in view, and that is to encourage revelation, to establish truth. So we're trying to get people to say what really happened by telling them they won't be punished for it. Could it be then that underlying it all is the working out of that Christian theological precept, "The truth shall make you free"? Or do we seek answers for this unusual lesson of our time in a humanism that our own poets and philosophers have ascribed, in moments of race euphoria or contestation with the European world, as being uniquely African? The catalogue of crimes being committed against the Nigerian people during the current and preceding insanities of power has to be addressed at some future time. My attention to this theme is, obviously, not without a touch of political self-interest, and the reports that emerge from observers of all races and divergent political tendencies is that there is very little evidence of remorse at these public confessionals. Hardly any sense of credible transformation revealed among the actors in this unprecedented drama. Admittedly, these will always remain subjective impressions, but if the televised coverage I have watched, which included interviews with the self-confessed criminals, can be accepted as reliable evidence, I remain convinced that the answer to the missing question, at least one that I never heard put, would be, "Oh yes, given the same circumstances, I would do the same thing all over again." This last part of the review, I'm going to read a long excerpt from the end of the essay, or in this case, the talk, which was about a coup that Soyinka witnessed himself in 1990 and a sort of extraordinary event that happened afterwards. The year was 1990, and I had been invited to Trinidad and Tobago's celebration of her 100th anniversary of emancipation, the formal end of slavery. And Trinidad and Tobago, the land of rum and Coca-Cola, cricket, carnival, and calypso, just had to pick on that very occasion to join a very trendy post-colonial club. The Sunshine Island of Trinidad, at least, decided that she was entitled to a place in postmodern history by staging her very own coup d'etat. It would appear that a bunch of harebrained adventurists, masquerading under a religious banner, had been training with some Mark IV rifles and the odd assault weapons in some equivalent of the American Freeman enclave. They finally moved to take over the House of Parliament during its session and to take the legislators hostage, announcing a change of government. The radio and television stations were also seized. Narrating the full details of that insolent parody of a coup d'etat is much too tempting, so I had better not even attempt a resume of it. Suffice it to say that coming from a land where we live on a diet of coups for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and yet end up with empty stomachs, I felt profoundly insulted to be caught in such a tawdry impudence of revolutionary aping and its accompaniment of illiterate bombast. It's such an articulate way of Soyinka saying, I know what coups are, and this is not a coup. In the uncertain atmosphere that followed this coup, some Trinidadians went on a looting spree. The shopping centers were mostly left untouched. Few were willing to venture that far from the security of their homes. No, it was the neighborhood stores that were broken into and looted. And this was what shocked the majority of the Trinidadians most. A few camera crews ventured out, and some of the looters were caught on film. This did not seem to bother them. I suppose they thought it was simply a variation on the carnival. Television sets, stereos, refrigerators, some had succeeded in rustling up the odd car or utility truck to facilitate the exercise. Several of the shopkeepers were later interviewed. The shock on their faces and in their voices was most pathetic, and it was the usual story. Quite a number knew who the looters were. They had lived with them as neighbors for generations. This was the end of the world for them. They were quitting once the saga was over. Other Trinidadians were equally outraged or simply numbed with shock. An independent radio that had escaped seizure by the self-serving revolutionaries broadcast these tales of woe. The coup, it seemed, had unleashed the unsuspecting beast of prey lurking in the easy-going Calypso personality. Well, after some 3 or 4 days of stalemate and the personal indignity of being trapped on the island by a pack of cretinous dilettantes, the police got tired of the waiting game with the captors and their hostages and moved to at least save the community from itself. Taking advantage of the independent radio that had escaped seizure, the chief of police went on air and lectured the Trinidadians on their evil ways. Like a stern schoolmaster, he reminded them that this kind of act was un-Trinidadian, and warned that it would not be tolerated. Then he gave them all 48 hours to return the looted property. Just lay down your loot in front of your houses, he said. We will come round and collect them and return them to their owners. No questions asked. Return your loot and let Trinidad return to herself. I drove around afterward with a friend. I could hardly believe my eyes. These goods were laid down neatly in front of houses. In some cases, looters who felt somewhat shamefaced, they appeared to cut across all classes, had asked neighbors to run the stuff over to the rightful owners. Some have apparently contacted their fellow felons and organized anonymous collective returns. Wheelbarrows were trundling through the streets in reverse directions, filled with clothing, toys, appliances, etc. The rum and beer were of course never recovered, but even the shopkeepers did not seriously expect to see such items restored to their shelves in undepleted forms. Something, after all, was needed to calm the nerves of a people during those tense days of the takeover of a nation. Now that was Trinidad. I tried hard to imagine the same scenario in my own native land of Nigeria. An appeal to return looted material? There would be picks and shovels in motion all night for temporary internment of stereos, refrigerators, and motorcycles. Rodents, wildfowl, and antelopes would find their repose rudely interrupted by the roar of looted motor cars crashing through their territory for temporary ensconcement. But it was not always so. When a people have been continuously brutalized, when the language of rulers is recognized only in the snarl of marauding beasts of prey and scavengers, the people begin to question, mistrust, and then shed their own humanity, and for sheer survival themselves become predators on their own kind. The real extract from our Trinidadian excursion, however, is the place of restitution in the order of society. Yes, there was a general amnesty. A social aberration had taken place, which could easily, because of the circumstances, be extenuated. A contagious, temporary insanity. Even so, however, the general remission was conditional. Restitution must first be made. This was the bedrock. If the fabric of society, ruptured by the double violence of the coup and the looting, was to be healed, there had first to be restitution. Truth alone is never enough to guarantee reconciliation. It has little to do with crime and punishment, but with inventiveness, devising a social formula that would minister to the wrongs of dispossession on the one hand, chasten those who deviate from the humane communal order on the other, serve as a criterion for the future conduct of that society, even in times of stress, and only then heal. Memory of what has been, of acts of commission or omission, of a responsibility abdicated, affects the future conduct of power in any form. Failure to adopt some imaginative recognition of such a principle merely results in the enthronement of a political culture that appears to know no boundaries, the culture of impunity. And I can think of no better direct application for those of us who are Americans than to think about the theft of the Black Hills from the Lakota people, also known as the Sioux. I talked about this in a film club, and I'll put a link to that in the description as well as put up a card. But we have an example there of something that is almost completed, which is land was stolen. It was recognized by the U.S. Supreme Court as stolen, and now what needs to finish that action is for the land to be returned. We have precedent for this in other cases with the Japanese citizens who were interned. They had reparations paid to them. And we have the Taos Indians, which I referenced in the film club discussion. They were given some land back as well, so there's no reason why the Black Hills could not be given back to the Sioux. It would do all the things that Soyinka talks about here. It would satisfy justice and would set a template in the future for people to look back and say, here's what you do when you make a mistake. You make it right. And you make sure you put things in place to make sure that the theft of land institutionalized by government doesn't happen again. So, as I say, it's very short, both of these essays together, not even 200 pages. And as you heard me read, absolutely gorgeous, beautiful writing by Wole Soyinka. And I'll review other books of his in the future, but for now, I just want to keep on theme with some of the things that we've been discussing on the channel recently. If you enjoyed this, hit like, subscribe, share this with other people who would be interested in some of the themes that I discussed. Consider supporting the channel by becoming a member of my Patreon or YouTube members. Either of those are the same in terms of access to me, private discussions that I'll have with people who are paid members. If you want to just support on a one-time basis, you can send a super like through YouTube, or you can use PayPal or buy me a coffee. Those are linked in the description. And if you'd like to nominate books for 2025, you can find that on my Amazon wish list. Buy one of those, send it to me, and I'll review it. If it's on my wish list, it means I want to buy the book already. And a reminder, as we're coming to the end of 2024, that during this year, a portion of the proceeds from any of these different channels is going to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which helps Palestinian children who could not otherwise get medical care get that care that they need. They're a fantastic organization. Even if you don't want to support them indirectly through my channel, consider following the link and supporting them directly. They could use your help potentially more than ever. As always, enjoy your reading.